Good morning. Are we all right? Good. So we are continuing our journey through Matthew's Gospel. And as Andy said, we are coming to the end of Matthew chapter 10, which I'm grateful for, because it's a challenging chapter. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. Does that sound like the words of Jesus? It is. But I think it's designed to shock. It's supposed to jar us. It's supposed to call us to attention. But part of the challenge is that just a few chapters earlier in Matthew 5, we read this. Jesus also saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Or how about this from Luke chapter 2, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace, and on earth peace among people." Or Luke 1, that he, the coming Messiah, will guide our feet into the way of peace. James, the fruit of righteousness, is shown in peace by those who make peace. I can keep going. 1 Corinthians, God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. Paul in Ephesians, for he is our peace. He has broken down the dividing wall of hostility between us. And then Jesus says, do not think that I've come to bring peace on the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. I need to get me one of these mugs. I can do all things through a verse taken out of context. Whenever you find a verse like this, something that you find jarring, something that you're wondering, what is going on here? This seems so contradictory, so problematic. Can I suggest you do a few things? One, you look in the context of the chapter that it's written in. Then you move out and you look at the book that it's written in. Then maybe you think about which testament it is. And finally, you try to think about that verse in the context of the large sweep of the Bible story. The context for this verse, you remember, is the beginning of Matthew. And the beginning of Matthew, we spent several weeks looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And let me remind you a little bit about what we read as we read our way through the Sermon on the Mount. I'm afraid that screen's broken, so I'm reliant on this one this morning. This is a summary of the Sermon on the Mount. Let your light shine, turn the other cheek, love your enemies, pray and work for God's kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven. Avoid anger, lust, adultery and hypocrisy. Treat women with respect, keep your word. Store up treasures in heaven, don't hoard stuff, don't judge others, seek God's kingdom first. Treat others as you would like to be treated. Live this, and you are building solid foundations. That is the context at the beginning of Matthew that Jesus is speaking into. And I recently came across this on a discussion about what is the gospel. Joe and Nick were talking about what is the gospel, and it came up with this. When speaking about the gospel, such an inclusive love of people and the environment will give you a passion for justice and can bring you into direct opposition with dominating, controlling, and evil power structures. And so, following the way of Jesus may involve persecution, suffering, and premature death. The sword that Jesus is talking about is a sword that will cause division. Because if you live this way, if you stand up for the rights of the oppressed, when you stand up for justice, when you stand up for inclusion, you may find yourself coming into conflict with the power structures in the world. You may even find yourself coming into conflict within your own family. So Jesus is saying, yes, this sword that I bring may bring division, because standing up for what is right sometimes causes that. And we don't have to look too far back in history to see examples, do we? Think of Martin Luther King standing up for the rights, civil rights in South America, for the rights of black people, walking across that bridge in Selma into waiting police and arrest. Think of Nelson Mandela in prison for 27 years for standing up for the rights of his people. Living this way may bring you into opposition. It may cause division. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story of St. Francis of Assisi. I guess many people have heard of him. You'll have heard of the prayer of St. Francis. You knew that he's perhaps most famous for preaching to the animals. But that's probably where most of our knowledge of St. Francis ends. One of the purposes of saints in the Christian tradition is to be examples of how to follow Christ in the world. And what's interesting when I researched St. Francis of Assisi is he was born into a very, very wealthy Italian family. Born to a prosperous silk merchant. And he lived as a young man the life of a typical wealthy man. He was handsome and delighted in fine clothes, bright colours, rich friends, and the love of pleasures. But it's interesting as St. Francis's faith begins to grow, he's selling cloth and silk in the marketplace for his father when a beggar came up and asked him for alms. And so the story goes, Francis sold the silk that he had on the stall, and instead of returning the money to his father, he gave it to the beggar, bringing him into some conflict with his father, it has to be said. Later on pilgrimage to Rome, he stopped at the church of San Damiano, where apparently he had a vision, and God was supposed to have God said to Francis, "Francis, go and repair my church, which you can see is falling into ruins." Well, he immediately took that to be the church in San Damiano. So again, he sold his father's silk that he had with him and gave the money to the priest there. When he returned home at the end of this trip, he's reported to have hid in a cave rather than face his father. But when he finally got so hungry that he had to go home, he was dragged around the town by his father, beaten, bound, and locked in a small storehouse. Eventually freed by his mother, he returned to San Damiano, where he was forced to forego his inheritance and renounce his father and his family. He spent the next few months wandering as a beggar around the hills in Assisi. An example where trying to follow God, trying to do the right thing, brought him into immediate conflict with his family. Tom Wright puts it like this in his commentary. He, Jesus, didn't want to bring division within households for the sake of it, but he knew that if people followed his way, division was bound to follow. However, what's interesting is I think there is something else going on in this passage. Have you heard of the prophet Micah? Don't worry if you haven't, but a reading from Micah often comes up at the carol service at Christmas. It's one of the 12 lessons and carols. But you, Bethlehem, though you are small, out of you will come one who will be ruler over Israel. The prophet Micah is talking about the coming Messiah, the one who will come to liberate and free God's people. And interestingly, he says that when that Messiah comes, comes, sons will treat the father with contempt. The daughter rises up against her mother, the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Your enemies are members of your own household. Did you recognize that from the Matthew passage? Matthew is directly quoting the prophet Micah, saying that this was prophesied. This was prophesied that when the Messiah comes, there will be division, and that division will go right through the middle of households. And here Matthew's saying is, here it is. Here is Jesus. Here is the one who was prophesied, who was talked about. Here is the Messiah, and here is what is happening. Following him is becoming costly. Friends, there is a cost to discipleship. Verse 37 says this, whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. It's a hard verse. I love this quote from Dallas Willard, and let me try to unpack it a little bit for you. Dallas Willard, the famous philosopher, said this, grace is opposed to earning, not to effort. There is a cost to discipleship. Yes, I 100% accept that. Grace is, I also am believe fully in the grace of God. That actually our salvation is a free gift of God, that you are loved by God. And that our task in this is to realize that, and not a lot more. That you are loved by God exactly as you are. And our task is to realize that and live into it. That is the grace of God for each one of us. But once we've done that, it calls us to a life. And that grace calls us to a life and a lifestyle. Now, you remember Martin Luther, don't you? Martin Luther got into that argument with whether it's faith or works. If I could be so bold, I'm not sure his issue was particularly, or should have been with works, but more about earning. That we do not do stuff in this world in order to earn. Our salvation is a free gift. It is a gift of grace. We do not get involved in living out the Sermon on the Mount to earn our salvation. That is the gift of God. But that gift of God is not opposed to effort. What it is opposed to is earning. They're called spiritual disciplines for a reason. Disciplines. Grace is opposed to earning, not effort. I came across this quote this week. People prefer comfort to challenge. But if you want to grow, do the hard thing. I think that can be true in all sorts of areas of our life, including our spiritual lives. We often seek out comfort rather than challenge. But if we want to grow, maybe there's an argument for doing the hard thing and taking on the challenge. I came across this book this week by Arthur Clarke and Oprah Winfrey. You'll have heard of at least one of those. It's a book called Build the Life You Want. And to put it in its context, Arthur Clarke teaches the most oversubscribed class at Harvard Business School. His class is on the science of happiness. And there's a massive waiting list to get into his class. Interestingly, both Arthur and Oprah are Christians. And Arthur suggests that after 30 years of studying social science, and particularly the science of happiness, he has identified 3 pillars to human happiness. And I just want to talk about one of them today, and that's his 3rd pillar. And that is meaning and purpose. They say in this book that actually, if you want to find a meaningful life, if you want to build the life you want, if you want to find happiness, one of the pillars you have to have in your life is meaning and purpose. And he goes on to say that for both of them, the best way that you can find meaning and purpose for your life is through faith. In fact, chapter 8 of this book, which is incredibly popular at the moment, is called Find Your Amazing Grace. And it starts with the story of John Newton. Here's this book written for a secular audience on how to live a happy life. And they are calling people in chapter 8 to faith in the gospel. British belief is strongly correlated with searching for and finding purpose in your life. Arthur says when he's teaching his class, he sets them an assignment in order to find their purpose. And this is how he says you know if you found purpose in life. 2 questions, 500 words on each. What are you living for? And for what are you prepared to die? What are you prepared to die for? When you can truly answer those questions, you have found the meaning and purpose piece. They suggest there are places you can find that. There are all sorts of ways you can find that. But by far the most effective is within the life of faith. It rather reminded me of this. Those who find their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake will find it. On one level, that's a very daunting verse. On another level, it is fundamental and liberating. Because when you know what you are living for and when you know what you are prepared to die for, you can really start living. You know, it's said we live 2 lives. And the second one starts when you realize you've only got one. I'll say that again. It is said we have 2 lives, and the second one starts when you realize you've only got one. So what are you living for? Yes, that might cause division. But it's also a life of meaning, purpose, and direction. And friends, we need that as human beings. We are wired for that. Encouragingly, the passage ends that you can start small. Once you've identified what that is, take the next small step. In the case of this passage, whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in my name, in the name of a disciple, truly, I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. Start small. You know, often, consistency in the small stuff from day to day is harder than the big dramatic gestures. We can make the big dramatic gestures once a year, twice a year. But actually, daily commitment to the small stuff is what compounds to make the difference. Let's just pause for a moment. Perhaps I'll call you back to those questions. Friends, what are you living for? Do you know what you would be prepared to die for? Christ calls us, Jesus calls us to live for him. He sets out in the Sermon on the Mount what that looks like. It's costly. It's free, it's a gift of grace. But it may bring you into division, persecution, with the state, possibly even within families. But it is also the source of the purpose and meaning in life that you are looking for. And those who lose their lives will find it for my sake, says Jesus.